In the dead of winter, with 10 days of snow and ice closing in on Lancaster County, Eli Stoltzfus faced a test that would stretch his resolve beyond measure. With the mercury plunging far below zero, his cabin, once warm with the rhythm of his blacksmithing, was now at risk of being buried under the weight of the cold. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if stories of quiet perseverance, craftsmanship, and simple ingenuity speak to your heart, join us for tomorrow's tale. It was late in November when the first snow came, silent at first, then relentless. It fell gently at first, like a whisper from the heavens, but by morning it had become a blanket, covering Lancaster County in a quiet white. Eli Stoltzfus stood in his doorway and looked out over the land, his face creased with thought. The mountains had begun their seasonal shift, their winds carrying a chill that crept deeper into the bones than usual. He didn't mind the cold. In fact, he welcomed the quiet it brought, the stillness of winter when the earth seemed to slow down. Yet, even with the wind howling outside and the snow piling up against his cabin walls, Eli was never fully comfortable with the idea of a harsh winter. The weight of experience in his years as a blacksmith had taught him that winter wasn't just a season, it was a test, one that asked every man and woman to prepare in ways they often didn't fully understand until it was too late. His cabin stood sturdy, built with care and precision, but even so, Eli knew that in the worst of winters, even the finest craftsmanship could fail. He had already sealed the roof tight, and the hearth was stacked high with logs of oak and maple that would burn long through the cold nights ahead. Yet, something gnawed at him the ventilation system in his walls. A simple design he had created long ago, it was meant to regulate airflow and keep the cabin warm through the coldest nights. But would it be enough? As Eli gathered his tools in the workshop, his mind wandered back to that morning in early fall when he first saw the early frost gather on the trees. It had been an omen, one that told him to prepare well, and he had. The iron stove was double insulated, and the hearth was reinforced with iron slats. He even took the time to carefully place a vent along the far wall of his shop, an idea inspired by years of watching the way air moved through the walls. No one knew of the vent but him, and though the neighbors often teased him for his obsession with ventilation, Eli had always trusted in the quiet power of preparation. Outside, the snow swirled, thickening as the wind picked up. The world seemed to be closing in, and he couldn't help but feel the pressure of the cold winter days ahead. Each snowflake that settled upon his roof brought a growing weight, an invisible burden that no man could escape. His breath formed small clouds in the air as he moved about the cabin, making small adjustments. He checked the fire again, ensuring it was steady. But as the darkness began to fall, Eli couldn't help but wonder had he prepared enough. The first night of the storm was a long one. The wind screamed through the valley, its shrieks cutting across the dark sky. Eli sat by the hearth, his gaze flickering to the glowing embers as they shifted in the stone firebox. His family lay asleep in the rooms above, tucked beneath quilts woven by his wife's hands. His children, warm in their beds, were unaware of the struggle happening just beyond the walls of their cabin. Yet Eli lay awake, his thoughts churning with the weight of the night. He knew the storm was only the beginning. The air was thick with the promise of more snow, more cold, and the quiet fear that gripped his heart. It wasn't just the cabin he worried about, it was the quiet, relentless force of nature itself. Could he truly trust that simple vent in the wall to keep them safe? Every winter, the cold seemed to find a way into even the most secure of homes, slipping in through cracks, under doors, and through gaps too small to notice. Eli could hear the wind howling outside, but inside, all was still, save for the gentle crackle of the fire. The fire was a good one, but he knew it wouldn't be enough to fight back the cold that would soon seep in from the walls. That's when his mind returned to the wall vent. That vent, crafted with care and intuition, had been designed to allow a steady flow of air without letting in the chill. But was it truly enough? The neighbors would laugh at him if they knew, but he wasn't building for others. He was building for survival. Eli walked quietly to the wall where the vent was hidden behind a layer of stone. He traced his fingers along the edge of the opening, feeling the cool stone beneath his hand. It was a small detail, barely noticed by anyone but him. but it was a detail that, if done wrong, could be the difference between surviving and succumbing to the cold. Outside, the storm continued to rage. As the hours stretched on, the temperature dropped even further. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than it should, considering the ferocity of the weather outside. Eli stood at the hearth, keeping an eye on the fire, but it was the wall vent that kept him at ease. It was his creation, one that few knew about, but one that he trusted more than anything else. In the stillness of that long night, with the howling wind outside and the darkness wrapping itself around their home, Eli found a quiet comfort. The fire was burning low, and yet he was warm. The vent, his secret, was working. He could feel the subtle shift in the air, the way it moved around the room, carrying the warmth just enough to keep the cabin safe. It wasn't magic, it was his work, his faith in the careful choices he had made. And for the first time that night, as the wind howled outside and the cold crept closer, Eli felt a quiet certainty that perhaps, just perhaps, he had done enough. The days passed slowly, each one colder than the last. The snow fell steadily, and with it came the bitter wind that cut through the valley like a knife. Lancaster County, normally so quiet, now felt heavy, as if the whole world had drawn in a deep breath and was holding it. Inside Eli's cabin, life continued as usual. His family ate together, prayed together, and worked together. But beneath the surface, Eli's mind never strayed far from the cold. The fire in the hearth burned as brightly as ever, but it was no longer enough to fight the cold seeping in from the cracks between the logs, no matter how much firewood he chopped. The cabin was holding steady, but outside, the winter storm raged on, as fierce as it had been the day it began. Night after night, Eli would lie awake, listening to the wind batter the windows, testing the walls. Each time he turned his attention to the wall vent, he felt a sense of comfort, though small. It was his secret, and he trusted it. Still, doubt crept into his heart. He could hear the whispers of other families in the community, their voices tinged with fear. Some had already started to make plans to leave, to go to town and seek shelter with relatives. The first few days of the storm had been manageable, but now, as the weather continued to worsen, the struggle was wearing on everyone. Eli's neighbors spoke of cracked fireplaces, frozen doors, and dwindling firewood. There was talk of running out of food before the trains could arrive with supplies. Eli listened to their worries, but inside he knew that the one thing he couldn't afford was panic. By the 5th day of the storm, the town was starting to feel the weight of it all. Some families were already rationing their food, while others began reinforcing their cabins with blankets and whatever they could find. A few men had ventured out to check on their neighbors, their faces grim from the strain. One of them, Levi, knocked on Eli's door late one evening, his breath a cloud in the cold air. "Eli, can you spare some firewood? We're running low, and the wind's still howling like a wolf in the night." "Not sure how much longer our stove will hold out," Levi said, his voice barely rising above the howling wind. Eli could see the fatigue in his friend's face, the signs of long days spent battling the winter. Eli nodded, standing aside to let him in. "You're welcome to what we have. But Levi?" He paused, his mind turning. "You've noticed the warmth inside, haven't you?" Levi raised an eyebrow. "Your house? Of course. There's a steady heat in here. What are you doing differently?" Eli smiled softly, though his heart still carried the weight of his own uncertainty. "It's the vent in the wall. It lets the air move just enough so the heat stays in and doesn't escape through the cracks." Levi seemed skeptical, but after a long look around the cabin, his doubt softened. "A vent, you say? Never heard of such a thing." Eli didn't respond. Instead, he went to the woodpile, pulling out a large bundle of firewood and bringing it to the door. As he did, he noticed that the firelight flickered warmly off the walls, a quiet assurance that the choices he had made would hold, if just for this season. By the end of the 10th night, the wind began to lose its bite. The storm had not stopped, but its fury had lessened, leaving behind a blanket of thick snow and still air. The mornings were quieter now, though the air still carried a crisp chill. The fire in Eli's hearth remained steady, the warmth within the walls more constant than ever before. As the days passed, Eli allowed himself small moments of rest. He spent his time in the workshop, quietly crafting tools for the spring. His wife Rachel worked beside him, mending clothing and tending to the children. It was during one of those quiet moments that the knock came again. This time, it was not Levi, but an older neighbor, Samuel. He entered with a gentle smile, but his eyes were tired, a reflection of the long days they'd all been enduring. "Eli," Samuel began, "I've been meaning to stop by, but things have been hectic in town. You've kept your home well through this, I can see. I've heard the story of your wall vent from Levi. Would you mind showing me?" Eli smiled. Samuel was a man of few words, but his respect for Eli's craftsmanship had always been clear. The older man wasn't quick to ask for help, and when he did, it meant something. Without a word, Eli led Samuel to the wall where the vent was hidden. He explained how it worked, how the subtle airflow kept the cold at bay, and how, though simple, it had been enough to protect them. Samuel examined the vent carefully, his brow furrowing in thought. "Never would have thought of something like this," Samuel muttered, his voice a blend of admiration and curiosity. "Could have saved me a lot of trouble." They stood there for a moment, side by side, in silence. Outside, the world was still blanketed in snow, but the worst of the storm had passed. The wind had calmed, and the worst of the cold seemed to be ebbing. Eli could feel the warmth in the air inside the cabin, the steady heat radiating from the hearth. It wasn't just the fire, it was the vent, working as it had been designed to. Samuel turned to Eli, his voice filled with quiet respect. "You've done more than just build a shelter, Eli. You've built a home that can survive anything." Eli didn't respond immediately. Instead, he smiled softly, his thoughts drifting to the faith that had guided him in his work. The storm had tested him, yes, but it had also proven his trust in the simple things, his work, his faith, and his family. And in the end, those things had seen him through. As Samuel left, Eli returned to his work, his heart light. The storm had tested their resolve, but it had not broken them. Spring was still far away, but the warmth inside his home told him that they had made it through the worst. The rest would come in time. The days grew longer as February passed, and slowly the grip of winter began to loosen. Eli Stoltzfus stood by the hearth one evening, staring into the steady, glowing fire, his mind quietly reflecting on the storm that had nearly consumed Lancaster County. His family, once so tightly wrapped in fear and concern, now moved with a calm certainty that the worst was over. The air inside the cabin was warm, soft against the lingering chill outside, and the sounds of his children's laughter filled the house once more. For Eli, the winter had brought a kind of clarity, an understanding that the small things, those seemingly insignificant decisions made in the quiet moments, held the most power. He had spent years perfecting his craft, creating works of art and function in iron, and yet it was the quiet act of designing a simple wall vent that had proven to be the most important work of his life. The vent had been built on instinct, an understanding of airflow that had come from years spent working with the heat of the forge where heat, air, and structure converged. But in those quiet moments of reflection, as Eli sat with his wife and children at the table, he realized that it was more than just his craftsmanship that had kept them safe. It was the careful attention to the quiet details of life, the work that no one else would see, that had made the difference. In building his home, he had built not only a refuge from the elements, but a place where his family could thrive, even through the harshest trials. Outside, the world had begun to thaw. The snow that had piled high against the walls was slowly retreating, leaving behind a blanket of wet earth. Eli stepped outside one morning, his boots crunching against the still frozen ground. The sun shone weakly through the clouds, a sign that the days ahead would be warmer. For the first time in weeks, he felt the familiar warmth of the sun on his face. As he looked across the field, he saw the faintest hints of green beginning to peek through the soil, the promise of life returning. Inside, his children were preparing for spring planting, their small hands eager to help with the work. His wife, Rachel, hummed softly as she kneaded bread dough, the familiar rhythm of her hands a comfort to him. The home they had built was no longer just a refuge from the storm. It had become a symbol of their endurance, of the quiet strength that could be found in patience, faith, and the unyielding belief that the simplest things like a wall vent, carefully placed, could make all the difference. As evening fell and the fire in the hearth crackled softly, Eli sat with Rachel by his side. The children had fallen asleep, their bodies curled beneath heavy quilts. For the first time in weeks, there was a sense of peace in the air. Eli gazed out the window at the darkening sky, and for a moment he allowed himself to feel the deep satisfaction of knowing that they had made it through. Not just the winter, but everything. They had withstood the storm, not because they were stronger than the cold, but because they had trusted in what they had built, in the small things that others might dismiss. By March, the worst of the winter had passed. The winds that had howled through the valley now carried the scent of earth and wet stone, a promise of warmer days ahead. The snow, which had once buried the ground beneath its weight, now melted in patches, revealing the grass and mud beneath. In the Stoltzfus cabin, life returned to its quiet rhythm, but Eli knew that the lessons of the long winter would stay with him forever. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the light inside the cabin softened to a golden glow, Eli sat at the table with Rachel, his hands resting on the worn wood. It had been a season of struggle, but it had also been a season of growth. He had learned something fundamental about the world around him, that sometimes the most important things were the quietest. And while the storm had tested them, it had also reaffirmed his belief in the power of simplicity. There was no grand revelation, no dramatic conclusion to the winter. It was in the subtle moments, the quiet exchange of faith between him and Rachel, the way his children had grown from the experience. They had learned to rely not just on the fire and the food stored in the cellar, but on each other and on the steady presence of their faith. As Eli reflected on the storm, he thought about the conversations he had shared with his neighbors. The vent, once something he had designed out of a quiet understanding of the land, was now a source of curiosity. Neighbors who had once dismissed his ideas now came to him, asking for advice, eager to learn from the lessons of his careful planning. Levi, whose own cabin had nearly failed him, now sought out Eli's guidance. "I never saw the value in small things like a vent," Levi confessed one afternoon, his face serious. "But I see now. It wasn't just the fire, it was the careful thought, the attention to detail. You knew something we didn't." Eli nodded quietly, his hands steady as he spoke. "It's not just about building a shelter. It's about building something that can hold, something that can survive the cold, the wind, the doubt. It's about creating something that endures." As the spring approached and the final traces of snow melted, Eli felt a quiet peace settle within him. The storm had come and gone, but its lessons remained. He had been tested, not just in his craftsmanship, but in his faith. And now, as the earth began to thaw, he knew that the warmth they had found wasn't just the result of a well-built home, it was the result of years of patience, hard work, and the trust in something greater than himself. He had built not just a cabin, but a legacy, and in the coming seasons, as the land flourished once again, he would remember that the most enduring things were often the simplest, and that faith, much like the warmth of a home, was something that could always be relied upon. As the warmth of spring slowly returned to Lancaster County, Eli Stoltzfus felt the weight of winter lift from his shoulders. The snow that had once piled high against the walls of his cabin now melted into the earth, nourishing the soil that would soon cradle the seeds of a new season. The sun rose higher each day, and with it came the promise of growth, not only in the fields, but within his community as well. It wasn't long before the neighbors began to visit. Their houses, once strained by the fury of the winter, had survived but just barely. Some, like Levi and Samuel, had already begun to make repairs. The cracks in their homes, the drafts in their walls, and the cold that had seeped into their bones during the hardest months had left them weary and vulnerable. Now, with the spring thaw in full swing, they came to Eli with a quiet reverence, asking questions about his home and, more specifically, the vent he had built. Levi was the first to approach him one afternoon, walking down the well-worn path toward Eli's cabin with a sense of purpose in his step. His face, which had once been lined with skepticism, now held a more thoughtful expression. When Eli opened the door, he stepped inside without hesitation. "You've had a hard winter, I can see," Eli said with a soft smile, offering his neighbor a seat by the hearth. Levi nodded, rubbing his hands together. You could say that. It's been a long few months, Eli. We've been patching up the cracks in the walls, trying to keep the cold at bay, but it wasn't enough. My cabin held, but just barely. Levi paused, glancing toward the fire. I came by because I heard about your wall vent. Eli raised an eyebrow. Didn't think anyone would be interested in that old thing. Levi's gaze softened. Well, it seems that what others call simple might have been the key to keeping you safe. We've all been talking about it. The cold came at us like a storm we weren't ready for. But you were prepared. How? Eli sat down beside him, the fire crackling quietly in the background. It wasn't just about the vent, Eli began. It was about the attention to detail, about understanding the land and knowing that things often need more than just the obvious solution. I built this home with more than just shelter in mind. I built it to last. Levi nodded, slowly taking in the words. I see now. It's not about being the strongest in the storm, but about being ready for it. He leaned forward. I've been thinking about that vent, how the air moved, how it kept the warmth in, how it changed everything in here. And I realized I never thought to look at the small things. I only thought about surviving. But you, Eli, you thought about living. Eli smiled, gently. That's the key to it all. We build not just to survive, but to thrive, even when the storm rages. It's not the walls we put up, it's the thought we put behind them. With spring fully in bloom, Eli and his neighbors worked together to rebuild and strengthen their homes. The lessons of the harsh winter were not soon forgotten. As the men and women of the community rebuilt their cabins, they did so with a new sense of purpose. It wasn't just about speed or convenience anymore. It was about making sure that when the next storm came, they would be ready. Eli had become a quiet leader in the village, though he never sought the title. His work, his faith, and his patience had spoken louder than any words could. His neighbors began to adopt the same careful approach to building that he had, reinforcing their homes with double layers of insulation, better sealing, and, most importantly, attention to airflow. The vent, once seen as an eccentricity, was now a symbol of foresight, and Eli was more than willing to share his knowledge. One evening, as Eli and Rachel sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the fields, the weight of the past winter seemed to fade. The grass was green again, the trees beginning to blossom, and life, as always, was finding its way back into the world. Eli looked over at Rachel, her face peaceful in the evening light. "We made it, Rachel," he said softly, his voice full of quiet relief. "Not just through the winter, but through everything." She smiled, reaching out to take his hand. "You always knew we would. It wasn't just the vent or the fire that kept us warm, Eli. It was your faith. It was knowing you'd done everything you could." Eli squeezed her hand, his thoughts turning inward. It wasn't just about the work, the craftsmanship, it was about something deeper. The work he had done wasn't just for himself or his family, it was for the future, for the community, for the generations that would follow. And in that quiet certainty, he realized that sometimes the most important work is done not in the grand gestures, but in the quiet, steady acts of faith. As the days passed, Eli continued to work with his neighbors, teaching them the skills that had seen him through. He helped Levi rebuild his home, teaching him how to insulate properly, how to think about the small details that could make a world of difference in the harshest conditions. Slowly, Eli's knowledge spread, and the community grew stronger, not just in structure, but in spirit. When the next winter came, it did so quietly, without the fury of the previous one. But even in its stillness, Eli knew they had all been ready. The walls they had built were not just made of wood and stone, but of wisdom, faith, and a deep understanding of the land. And in the stillness of that new winter, as the fire crackled and the snow began to fall gently outside, Eli Stoltzfus found peace. He had built a life not just for himself, but for everyone around him. And that, he thought, was the greatest thing any man could do. By early autumn, the town of Lancaster had begun to feel the rhythm of the seasons once more. The harsh winter was a distant memory, but the lessons it left behind were ever present. Eli Stoltzfus could see the changes in his neighbors, the small adjustments they'd made to their homes, the new sense of caution in their work, the way they looked at the land with renewed respect. The blacksmith shop had settled back into its familiar hum. Eli's hammer struck the anvil with steady precision, shaping the iron as he always had. Yet, even in the familiar motions of his craft, he could sense the shift. The community had learned something valuable. That survival wasn't just about the tools they forged or the wood they cut. It was about understanding the invisible threads that connected them all, the unspoken faith in the simple, the humble, and the quiet things they often overlooked. One afternoon, as Eli worked by the forge, Samuel, the elderly neighbor who had long watched Eli's work with quiet admiration, came to visit. Samuel had been one of the first to recognize Eli's quiet wisdom and had since been making changes to his own home. His eyes twinkled as he walked in, carrying a small bundle of freshly picked herbs. "Eli," Samuel began, his voice tinged with a warm gratitude, "I've been meaning to tell you something. Your vent, well, it's more than just a bit of air. It's the reason my cabin kept the cold at bay. It's the reason my wife, Elsie, could sleep at night without shivering through the storm." Eli looked up, surprised, yet pleased by the compliment. Samuel had been one of the more skeptical ones during the harshest months. "I'm glad it helped, Samuel," Eli said, wiping his brow. "But it wasn't just the vent. It was every decision we made, every small thing we thought about and didn't overlook. It's those things that matter most." Samuel smiled and placed the herbs on the table. "Yes, Eli, I think we all see that now. The cold wasn't the real threat. It was the choices we didn't make, the things we thought too small to matter. The lesson was simple but profound. The quiet, often unseen details held the greatest strength. In their world, survival wasn't in the grand gestures, it was in the small, steady acts of faith and preparation. Eli's quiet work, his simple designs, had given the community the strength to endure. As the years passed, Lancaster County grew steadier, stronger, its people marked by the quiet wisdom of those who had endured the long winter together. Eli Stoltzfus, ever humble, never spoke of the lessons learned during that time, but they were woven into the very fabric of his life. Eli's blacksmithing shop continued to hum with activity, and the vent he had so carefully designed became a quiet legend in the town, a symbol of foresight and the power of simple things. Though the cold winters were no longer as fierce, the knowledge of how to endure them, how to build for the worst, remained deeply ingrained in the people of Lancaster. One day, as Eli worked on a new set of tools for a local farmer, a young man named Caleb came into the shop, eager and full of questions. Caleb had recently married and had taken over a plot of land outside the village. He had heard of Eli's work and, having built his own cabin the previous winter, had found himself struggling with the cold. "I've heard stories about your cabin," Caleb began, "how you kept warm during the worst of it, even when the others were freezing. What's the secret?" Eli paused, his hammer resting on the anvil. Caleb was eager, but there was no rush in Eli's response. "There's no secret," Eli said slowly. "It's all in the small things, paying attention to the details. The vent, the foundation, the way you build not just for the season, but for the unknowns that might come. It's not about a trick or a shortcut, it's about preparing and trusting in your work." Caleb nodded thoughtfully, taking in the advice. "I understand. My cabin was built quickly, just to get through the winter, but I think I see now what I missed." Eli smiled. "The key is patience. Do it right from the start, and it will last. And when the storms come, you'll know you've built something that can stand." As Caleb left the shop, Eli watched him walk down the path, his mind already turning toward the next task. Life was full of quiet work, the kind that didn't get recognized until it was needed most. But Eli understood that his true legacy wasn't in the iron he shaped or the cabin he built, it was in the knowledge he passed on to those who would carry it forward. In the end, it wasn't just about surviving the storms, it was about creating a foundation that would endure, just as the community had, built on trust, faith, and the simple, steady work that held everything together.